Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Andrew Mueller.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Andrew Mueller. I'm a contributing editor at Monocle magazine and the host of Monocle Radio's program, The Foreign Desk, on which I usually do speak more coherently than I just did then. There will be special episodes from GlobeSec coming up, not this Saturday, but probably the following couple of Saturdays after that, so do tune in. The topic today, of course, is the security stakes in the Arctic, and obviously, who better to chair such a discussion than an Australian? Helpfully, however, I do actually have three very good answers to that question, and they are Eivind Petersson, State Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Norway, Nicole Giles, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister and Deputy Director of Policy and Strategic Partnerships at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and Anna Wieslander, Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. Please make them welcome. Well, I think a place to start, and I'll start with you over on the end there, Anna, is just about the most recent threat to the equilibrium of Arctic security, and I think it comes from a source that few people would have guessed or predicted about a year or so ago, which is the United States. How seriously should we be taking Donald Trump's designs on Greenland?
Well, I think we did not really see that one coming to the extent that it has evolved. I mean, let me back a little bit. I think I've been following Arctic issues for quite some time, and it was evident that Russia and China were much more present and active in the Arctic than the US was for quite some time. So the first incident with President Trump was in 2019 when he was supposed to visit Denmark for a state visit and suddenly kind of discovered Greenland and its possibilities and said that, you know, why don't we buy Greenland? And then this was, of course, an incident of severe nature to Denmark, but still it vanished. So what we have now, I think, is a situation where Russia is still very present. It's correct analysis that Russia and China are very active in the Arctic, and that the US needs to be engaged. So that far, I think the U.S. interest is valid. But the way he has expressed himself, I think that's unhelpful is an understatement. Because what we have at this time is also actually a potential advantage for allies in the Arctic. Sweden and Finland have joined recently NATO. And if you have a situation where NATO is facing both Russia and China in the Arctic, this is, of course, a situation where we should work together as allies. And this makes it quite severe, not only for reasons of sovereignty for both Denmark and, in a way, Canada is also kind of dragged into this, even though Greenland belongs to the kingdom of, or is part of the kingdom of Denmark. But also because there are opportunities to strengthen NATO's geopolitical position in the Arctic, which the US is working completely against by having this policy. So my recommendation would be to abandon this immediately, basically, and just, try to see how we can work together as allies up in the Arctic.
And Nicole, a related question. How seriously do we need to take Donald Trump's designs on Canada?
Well, I think that our Prime Minister has been very clear that Canada will never become a 51st state of the United States. I think our perspective on it is that the continental defense perspective is a really important one to consider when we're talking about the roles of different countries and different NATO members in the alliance. And so our perspective is that by strengthening continental defense, which does require a more engaged United States in the Arctic, certainly requires a more engaged Canada in the Arctic, then that will actually make NATO stronger and that will make the alliance stronger. So we're choosing to see the engagement in the Arctic and the increased interest in the Arctic as a positive thing and an opportunity for us to be able to deepen and strengthen the alliances that we maybe perhaps haven't paid as much attention to as we should have in the last couple of decades.
So we're at least glad that the United States is paying attention.
Yeah.
Yes. It's always Canada's desire as middle power to be paid attention to.
Just before I bring Eivind in, I will remind everybody here and everybody who may be watching elsewhere that there will be an opportunity towards the end to put questions to this distinguished panel. Obviously, here I can take questions from the floor in due course. For people watching elsewhere, they will apparently turn up either on this screen or this one here in my lap. So do feel free to join in if you're watching remotely as soon as you've figured out how that works. But Eivind, to bring you in on this, because obviously Norway has the situation of sharing a land border with a potential antagonist in the Arctic, or at least one that has been thought of as a potential antagonist longer than the United States. Is there, do you think, a serious threat of borders in the Arctic actually shifting, i.e. of attempts being made to seize territory, or are the security concerns in the Arctic a bit more nebulous than that?
Well, first of all, I think the terms you use for Russia were maybe a bit too soft. At least Russia views itself as at war with us in the West. We're not as such at war with Russia, but the line of my government is that our country now finds ourselves in the most serious security situation since this end of the Second World War. So these are serious times. We are very much an Arctic country. 1/10 of our population live above the Arctic Circle. I spent my childhood growing up there, 6 kilometers away from the border that we do have with Russia in the far high north. Among my worries for the Arctic, contested borders are not really one of them, because it's unfortunately a misunderstanding about the Arctic that there's contest or empty legal space. It's actually rather organized and settled. We managed to agree on our maritime border with Russia 15 years ago. The Canadians and the Danes managed to agree on an island between Canada and Greenland. The Arctic is an ocean. We have the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. This actually works. It's not a contest of control over land. It's actually rather settled and organized, which many people do not realize.
But Anna, to bring you back in, do you have any fear that that will change? Because I think part of what Eivind is describing there is this idea of Arctic exceptionalism, it was called, that the countries that border the Arctic, whatever else they may or may not disagree on, they could usually all get together, Russia included, on issues pertaining to the Arctic. But I was struck when visiting the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, not last year but the year before, that everybody I spoke to just said that appears to be over, that all their professional and even personal contacts they had with Russians, and these were people who used to work in fairly benign fields like geology and other sciences, just said it's all gone cold. No one's talking to us anymore. So is that idea of Arctic exceptionalism, the idea that we can cooperate here if we cooperate nowhere else, is that over?
I think that's over, yes, definitely. I mean, you have to see the Arctic exceptionalism era in the period where it was developed, which was after the Cold War, and Arctic cooperation, Arctic governance took place. We formed the Arctic Council, where Russia is included, and then the 7 NATO allies now in the Nordics, Canada, the US. But it's actually, even the Arctic Council is has as military security, hard security, as an exception. I think it was Canada who proposed this. And that was the working mood and cooperative spirit for Arctic cooperation for a long time. But I've been writing about this since 2018, 2019. I think that it was still a low-tension area. Perhaps it still is in the way that Eivind described, that there are no border conflicts or no actual conflicts up there, but definitely more tensions. And what we have are here the great powers of the world, so to say, with various interests in the Arctic, but very different great powers. I mean, Russia is the largest Arctic country, largest territory, the largest coastline. It dominates the Northern Sea route. It has the most amount of its second strike capability hosted in the Kola base up in the Kola Peninsula for power projection globally. That's just a place where they're hosted. It's not where it's supposed to be a battle, right? So they have a major part of their natural resources up in the Arctic, and it's a substantial part of their GDP export and so on. So for Russia, the Arctic is extremely important, and they have a dominant position in the Arctic. China describes itself as a near-Arctic country, but it's a non-Arctic country from our perspective. It has no territory in the Arctic. It has no claim more than any other countries that are not part of the Arctic countries, but it wants to. It wants to. It has identified economic interests in the Arctic, natural resources. It has identified the melting ice opening up the polar route, which would substantially decrease the time it would take for them to have sea trade. And it would also decrease their dependency on the other sea routes where the US perhaps dominates the security situation. So they have established not only a lot of pitches or attempts to increase their economic footprint in the Arctic by investing or buying infrastructure. They've not been that successful, but they have attempted it. They have a vision of a polar Belt and Road Initiative. And they have also invested a lot in dual-use resources, such as satellites, sensors, and icebreakers. So they have more icebreakers going on than the United States, actually. But the power kind of relationship between Russia and China here is very interesting, because in the Arctic, Russia is kind of the dominating part, and China is more, it has to find win-win propositions and solutions in order to kind of extend its sphere of influence in the Arctic. Coercion doesn't really work there.
Nicole, further on the subject of Arctic exceptionalism, we were on another matter talking just backstage before we came out here about the peculiar draining power of wishful thinking at moments of crisis. Do we have to get past, do you think, any idea that this abrogation of Arctic exceptionalism is a glitch, that the Arctic countries are not, in fact, likely to be all good friends again anytime soon, and that this is no more or less now a contested space between the West and Russia than the Baltic Sea or indeed the frontiers of Ukraine?
I think that time is long gone, and that we're already in that headspace. And certainly the overlap very closely now between Arctic Council and NATO membership speaks to that. But I think part of it as well is the way that the threat and the competition in the Arctic is manifesting. And it's very different for different powers. So Russia, very much the military focus. But what we're seeing with China is all the threat vectors are being explored. Sabotage, espionage, economic coercion. There is a military aspect there as well. And so what that means is that there's a series of different vectors that are being pulled in different directions. And it also means that the targets are different. So the targets are no longer simply national governments, or in Canadian language, the federal government. It's all levels of government, states, provinces, municipalities, Indigenous governments and organizations, private sector, NGOs. And so what that means is that the threat landscape has shifted quite significantly because the threat targets have shifted quite significantly as well. So I think that also brings a different tone to the competition that we're seeing in that space, and also opens up some solutions when we talk about resiliency and how we protect against them and how we address those threats.
Eivind, what Nicole is describing there is an extraordinary and doubtless extremely expensive program of espionage and other forms of endeavor trying to further the influence of Russia and China in the Arctic. Is it clear to you that there are specific things they actually want from the Arctic, or are they, perhaps China most especially, just proceeding on the assumption of like, well, there must be something good there, and whatever it is, we want some of it?
Well, first of all, we should not treat Russia and China as twins in the Arctic. Russia is and will always be an Arctic country. Yes, they are still part of the Arctic Council. The way things are now, it's not possible to do anything resembling business as usual with the Russians. One thing is that they have deliberately chosen the war of aggression against another neighboring country. Domestically, the country has taken a totalitarian turn. Nonetheless, Russia has changed before and will change again. But for the time being, this is what we have to deal with. China in the Arctic is actually looking at the facts and the realities on the ground rather limited. Yes, that there's talk and there's interest and there's this somewhat silly concept of a near-Arctic state. Nonetheless, in reality, it's rather limited. Greenland has been brought up. I saw an interesting map the other day on Chinese interests in various mines and etc. on Greenland, with the color code underway or planned or abandoned. And every single dot along the coast of Greenland had abandoned, in the sense that, yes, there has been interest, but there are ways of dealing with that interest. My government, we have now an explicit policy when it comes to Chinese activity in our Arctic, in our high north. We have a restrictive approach. Yes.
How does that manifest practically?
Knowing full well that, for example, on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, some people say there's a Chinese research station. There is no Chinese research station. There's a Norwegian research station with a Chinese tenant. And that's actually a difference. It has to do, because most of what we see in our immediate neighborhood is Chinese research activity. And we must not be naive about these things. There's research and there's research.
What would be the differences there between research and research?
It's an old story that the opportunity to pursue legitimate activity can be abused for activities that we do not like.
I mean, Anna, you were the one who made the point earlier in this discussion that it is, I mean, it does seem somewhat risible for China to describe itself as a near-Arctic state. I mean, as anybody who's ever seen a globe will understand, it doesn't make much more or less sense than Mexico or Brazil describing themselves as near-Arctic states. But if China is taking an interest in the Arctic, is it hopelessly naive to think that they might actually be a partner of sorts to actual Arctic countries? Is there possibly a new Arctic exceptionalism that includes China, or would they be always, by definition, a rival?
Well, I think China has been an observer to the Arctic Council. It is still, and it is an observer to the Arctic Council, as a range of other countries. But the way I think about it, I mean, Russia and China, they do have a partnership with no borders, or something like that is the description. And that goes, of course, also the Arctic is not an exception from that. On the contrary, there was quite a lot of the Arctic in the document that kind of was released in conjunction with our announcement of this limitless partnership. So from that perspective, I think the natural way of looking at it, since there is a lot of military interest up in the Arctic for NATO allies. I do see how the overall global game kind of is reflected up in the Arctic, and it's not possible to distance it. It is the same Russia that is fighting in Ukraine and which hosts its capabilities up in the Kola Peninsula, and that would force itself out to the North Atlantic in case of anything and try to distract as much as possible of our sea lines of communications or reinforcements across the North Atlantic. It is the same country. So, of course, in that sense, the Arctic is very much part of a bigger picture. And I don't really see how you could, if you start playing with wedging between Russia and China in the Arctic, it couldn't be isolated. It would have to be a strategy that encompassed that country overall. There is no exception for the Arctic as I see it.
Well, Nicole, that brings us, I think, to one of the big questions here, and it is a question articulated by one of our remote viewers who asks, what role will an increased military presence in the Arctic play in regional tensions? Is it going to be defensive or offensive? Because there does not appear to be any real solution to any of this other than a significant militarizing of the Arctic, and if that is the case, well, is it going to be defensive, or does it potentially have an offensive capability or aspect as well?
I think that's maybe where the optimism comes in terms of hoping that it's not going to have a significant or high-intensity offensive capability. But I think that when we talk about the military presence in the Arctic, the securitization of the Arctic, depending on your perspective, can actually be a helpful thing. So from our perspective, certainly, Canada is going to be stepping up more. We've announced, the Prime Minister announced recently the major investments that we're going to be making in terms of having armed forces present, land, sea, air on a perpetual basis, increasing our over-the-horizon radar capabilities, other functions which could potentially be described as military presence and securitization, but that's actually what's bringing stability and security and prosperity to the Arctic, is our ability to be more engaged and to have more of a military presence in the Arctic. So I think, as with so many things in our field, it's somewhat in the eye of the beholder, the threat that's being faced. But I also think that the larger threat in some ways is actually the strategic competition game that's being played by China. So the economic coercion, the sabotage, the trying to corner the market in certain critical minerals, or to purchase the critical mineral rights to prevent other countries from developing critical mineral mines to be able to have that extraction. I think when we look at the broader strategic competition on the global scale and how the Arctic fits into that with China's strategy, that's where I think we see a lot of the threats manifesting and starting to stitch together in a way that is really challenging potentially the world order. And what we're seeing is that China's trying to pull every single string they can to try to manipulate that. And so, for example, one of the things that we've seen is a couple of years ago, there was an airplane hangar that located in Inuvik, so close to a NORAD site. It had been leased out. The owner was looking to divest themselves of it, and a Chinese state-owned enterprise was very close to purchasing it until the federal government was alerted to that purchase by local powers, and we had to come in and make that purchase and apply some of the similar rules and approach that Norway is applying. That could have been potentially devastating for us if that purchase had gone ahead and had been unnoticed. So I think we're seeing those incidents that might look like a small individual play, but when you put it in the context of China's broader strategic competition, it certainly adds a different, darker flavor to the activities that they're trying to participate in the Arctic.
Anna.
Yeah, just a two-finger on that because it's increasing. It's interesting to connect the dots. It was just recently a very similar story in northern Finland, where China wanted to purchase a facility close to where Finland and Sweden actually are building up the forward land forces for NATO. So, and a few years ago, I think it was in 2018, they wanted to purchase an airport. But it was rejected by the Finnish government because it was too close to military facilities. So China is watching this closely, and they are looking for these opportunities as they see it, and they are pursuing it. But on the other hand, as Eivind pointed out, we are also have our eyes on it and have been able to deal with most of it.
On that thought, Eivind, because I'm curious, are you aware of any from China of what we might think of as positive outreach to the Arctic countries, i.e. China offering, let's be a productive partner, let's work together on this? Because surely China can't hope to just go to the Arctic and take whatever it is that China wants without any cooperation at all from the actual Arctic countries. Or do I underestimate them?
No, certainly a lot of delegations and traffic and visitors, interest for various infrastructure in our region, maybe for investing and taking over ownership and control. And then the Chinese are able to think long term as well. And what's happening in the Arctic is that the ice is literally melting. This is the part of the world where global warming is happening 2, 3, 4 times faster than the global average, meaning that it is, on current trends, just a matter of time and until it will be possible to sail from Europe just straight across the Arctic Ocean and to East Asia, reducing transport times manifold. And that will be a bit of a revolution to global logistics infrastructure with security ramifications as well. And this is something the Chinese are positioning for as well.
Well, on that one, a question that is coming on Slido, Anna, and I do remind people watching at home that you can send questions in and they will pop up on that screener on this one. And also reminded to our audience that a couple more questions and I'm going to start asking you to do my job for me, so do start thinking of some things to put to the panel. The top question there, Anna, about how climate change affects the security threats that do prevail in the Arctic, and is there a way in which the Arctic countries can collaborate to, I guess, protect the Arctic citizens from it?
Yes, I think that's very much on the agenda already, actually, because the consequences are already there, erosion, and it affects the ecosystem, which affects the way you make a living and the way you feed yourself and so on for a lot of the indigenous people living there, but also others, for us up in the north, already on the agenda. So definitely that's part of it. I mean, you can't. Again, it's a global phenomenon with particular consequences for the Arctic, which means that the human security aspects of Arctic security is also very prevailing and on top of the agenda all the time, as I say it. Well, it also has military consequences. For instance, again, for Russia, with its hosting a lot of military assets, not only the Kola Peninsula, also other military installations, but part of that is for it to be covered by the ice. And when the ice is melting, that also, from the Russian point of view, makes them more vulnerable, which also increases their interest in guarding their bastion defense up in the north, which in turn then can, become a spiral of incidents or mishappenings that we do not intend. So from this perspective, it would be a situation where we would need actually more transparency, more cooperation on the military side, because also the conditions for military proceedings, operations, and storage up in the north, they're all changing. But unfortunately, that's not where we are politically. But it's a vulnerability for us, I would argue.
I think part of it as well is the collaboration to be able to build the resiliency. So trying to move into that pre-threat space before the threats are manifesting. And what that requires is not just the military to military and the intelligence to intelligence collaboration, but it also requires us to think differently about what sustainable development looks like in the Arctic and how we can use that to also build the resiliency to threats. So for example, the threat to critical infrastructure can equally come from a military perspective or from a climate change perspective. And how do we work with the communities? How do we work with the different governments who are located in the high north or the Arctic to ensure that they have duplication, that they're able to build the resiliency, they're able to identify the threats as it emerges. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunities for additional collaboration in a space where we maybe haven't had to think that way previously.
I'll start taking questions from the floor shortly, so do start thinking about things that you would like to put to the panel. Before we do that, Eivind, there's one that has arrived on the screen, I think, following up on your point about Svalbard and asking, do you see any real threat from Russia against Svalbard? They're particularly asking about whether there are still Russian coal miners on Svalbard. And obviously this has been a nightmare scenario potential that has been raised, because you can see how it would pan out. Russia would send a ship ashore, possibly containing people who may or may not be Russian naval personnel, or Russia may say, we have taken action to protect the rights of Russians being trampled underfoot by the brutal Norwegian jackboot on Svalbard. Is this a prospect that keeps you awake at night?
Not really. The basics, Svalbard has for exactly 100 years in August been part of the Kingdom of Norway. Norwegian sovereignty is actually undisputed. And when I say undisputed, I mean from everywhere, including from the Russians acknowledge that Svalbard is
Russia acknowledged Ukraine's borders at one point as well.
Well, we have a century of them doing exactly this. There's an interesting Ukrainian connection here as well, because currently there are 297 Russians living on Svalbard. 297 as of last week. They're coal miners, most of them. Historically, they've come from the Donbas region, so which is now Russian-occupied Ukraine. We've had some issues with passports of new republics, new constituent parts of the Russian Federation. Nonetheless, there are almost 300. We've had a century of experience in dealing with the Russians on Svalbard. During the Cold War, there were a lot more Soviet citizens there than there were Norwegians. Now it's 10 times more Norwegians than there are Russians on Svalbard. Svalbard is part of NATO as much as it's part of Norway. The archipelago is not demilitarized. Yeah, we are by treaty committed not to build fortifications, bases, but that does not mean that it's demilitarized. Meaning that yes, there are plans for how to defend every single square inch of our territory, and that of course includes Svalbard as well.
Okay, well, on that, I will now take some questions from the floor, should anybody have one. If you would sort of like to raise your hand so that even I can see it without my glasses on, or I will put my glasses on now that you've got nowhere to hide. Does anybody have a question they would like to put to the floor? Come on, we can't have covered everything. We have a hand over there. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Greetings from an American from Alaska, and if I can offer Alaska to Canada as a general apology, I would. There's been a lot of talk, I think rightly, about stepping up militarization, but the Arctic's kind of Russia's backyard, right? It's got a lot of capability. What's the danger of escalation there, where we're pushing them and maybe cornering them into an area that they've kind of considered at least maybe they're on an equal footing with some of the other great powers?
Nicole, before you take delivery of Alaska on behalf of the Commonwealth of Canada, would you like to address that?
Well, I think that it's actually not in Russia's interest to have the Arctic become a high-impact conflict zone. Russia's so incredibly dependent on their ability to extract oil and gas and to be able to ship oil and gas. Their entire development, their entire economy, their war effort depends upon that and being able to fund it. And if the Arctic did move into an active conflict space, and it would be, let's be frank, Russia that would have to initiate that, it's actually going to undermine their other military objectives and their economic development. And the Russian government's ability to keep its population supportive of their policies depends on having a base level of economic development, and that would all be threatened. So I think there's actually a shared interest in a bizarre type of way to not be moving into a high conflict space in the Arctic. But that being said, I think we're going to continue to see that low-level intensity, and I think in various places perhaps increasing low-level intensity, including foreign interference. So not just in our economy, but also in our democratic processes. And I think that's one of the things that we remain very concerned about, is the ability of Russia and also People's Republic of China to try to interfere in our democratic processes, which really goes to the heart of what our alliances are based on.
Eivind.
When I was making the point that the Chinese activity, the facts on the ground, do not really live up to the hype, I was referring to the North Atlantic Arctic. The question from Alaska, let me just be very clear that as for the North Pacific Arctic, the situation is somewhat different. This is, of course, literally closer to home for China, and to the extent that there's been Russian-Chinese military cooperation, Coast Guard cooperation, joint operation, that has taken place in the North Pacific Arctic, very, very close to Alaska. But Russia, to say the obvious, is a major Arctic state. But Russia's self-image is somewhat paranoid. They see threats everywhere. And then historians would point out, in terms of threats coming from across the European mainland, that they might have a point looking back in centuries. But then, looking north, they have been that has not been traditionally the flank that they've worried about, because it was ice covered, it was huge. Now that the ice is somewhat melting, and they feel the need to partly build, partly to rebuild military installations in the high north. But I wanted also to come back to Chinese-Russian cooperation. Our clear impression is that there is still Russian reluctance to have the Chinese, or to roll out all the red carpets for the Chinese in the high north. They have their own national sensitivities and reluctance, also when it comes to China. That is the picture as of today. This is an asymmetric relationship, and the asymmetry is just growing by the day, so this might change. But for the time being, at least in the our immediate neighborhood, where we keep very close eyes on what's going on, that's our clear impression, that there's still Russian sensitivities.
Does anyone else have a question? The last question we took reduced the USA to 49 states, so you see the impact we can have. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I have a mic already, if I may, just over here.
Yes, you have a mic. And
yeah.
You're in the dark. Sorry.
Sorry. Aaron Gash-Burnett, Democratic Strategy Initiative. I'd like to tie up a couple of points here that were mentioned. I'm originally from Canada myself. And I remember when I was in university, around that time, Russia actually planted the titanium flag at the North Pole. And I remember that at that time, whenever, the point about escalation was made earlier. So let me just say that if anyone's responsible for escalation in the Arctic, it is Russia, and it's been doing it for a long time. I remember even 20 years ago in university, every single time, or not every time, but quite often, when the Russians would buzz our airspace in Canada with planes, which they did very regularly, this would make the news quite a bit more often than it does now. And I compare that to the joint Russian-Chinese bomber squad that went up and also buzzed joint NORAD airspace not last year, here, and this is the first sort of exercise of its type that's been done. That did not get nearly as much play as I remember, it getting 20 years ago, and so that concerns me tremendously, because we are not necessarily perhaps as aware as a public as we should be about that kind of threat. Russia is our neighbor in Canada, but when we discuss Ukraine, it's over there. So how do we improve this in our societies, including our own, about, that this is actually a theater and has been for quite some time?
Anna, I'll put that to you because Sweden is a country that has taken this stuff extremely seriously, especially in recent years, to the extent of sending brochures and booklets out to households saying, here's what to do if things go hideously wrong. Are, I guess, countries further away from the Arctic, further away from Russia, perhaps not doing as robust a job as they might of explaining where we are to their publics?
Yeah, well, I think that might be natural now. I think the point is here that Canada is not that far away from Russia anyway, so I leave that up to you to elaborate upon. But I think, yes, of course, in Sweden we have done, I don't know if everyone knows about the booklet we have sent out. We did it for many years, and now we're doing it again on how to prepare each individual if the war would come, or if a conflict or war would come. And that's quite serious, of course, reading. But at the same time, and I think people are aware in Sweden at a certain level, but at the same time, I mean, what you said about escalation risks, for instance, I was thinking about the Swedish. We are an Arctic country, but more on the land side, not the ocean side. So. And for us, I still think we have work to do in explaining what the risks are up there. And it is, for us, mainly about the risk of a land grab up in the north. Because the Russian logic would be, as Eivind said, they feel squeezed and they want to extend their defensive bubble, as they call it, for their Kola base and for their military assets up in the north by grabbing land, Finnish or Swedish and possibly Norwegian land. And that would, of course, be a major provocation or escalation. But from the Russian point of view, just something you need to do in order to secure your assets. So, and I don't think we have explained that to a large extent to people because we do a lot of, I mean, we plan for more land forces up north, securing more, strengthening more infrastructure. And it has not only to do with Sweden being a transit country from Norway, Sweden, and then down to the Baltics. It also has its own logic up in the north. So there is always a story to tell. There's always an explanation to project to the people for them to understand what's going on. That's my major point, and I'm not sure that we are doing it, as total role models either, actually.
Nicole, you had something you wanted to add?
I think from the Canadian perspective, we are talking about national security more than we ever have, I think, since the Second World War. And I can't remember a federal election campaign where both major parties had aspects of their platform about the Arctic. And I think that speaks to the attention and the purpose that we're now approaching how we ensure our security in the Arctic. But I also think that the velocity and the volume of threats that we're facing is also very substantially different than it was 10 years ago. So I think the public's ability to pay attention to 100 specific threats that are emerging in a month versus 1 or 2 is also part of the math here, just in terms of what is capturing the public attention. But from our perspective, we have a prime minister that is laser focused on the Arctic, and we're going to see some very major investments in our ability to operate up there and to be able to also participate in how we ensure the security of the Arctic through increased integration with NATO and our European partners as well. So I think we're taking it more seriously than we've ever taken it before.
We are hurtling towards the point at which I'm going to have to ask you for some closing thoughts. Eivind, I'll ask you first of all as the member of this panel who I think is from furthest north. Fundamentally, what does the Arctic need? What is it going to need in the next 5 or 10 years to preserve the peace and ideally to preserve its resources for the nations of the Arctic? Does this just mean that there's going to be a lot of very cold soldiers?
Summers are nice and hot. I just got a photo from my parents that are now in this border town in the far north of Norway. The good news was that they don't have to cut their grass anymore because the reindeer walking around in the garden taking care of that. So that's one plus that you don't get everywhere else. This is an integral part of Norway, speaking from sort of as a representative of my national government. 10% of our population, they live normal lives, although with reindeer in the garden. Still, we have demographic challenges as well. And it's not a matter of having jobs, interesting jobs. It's a matter of getting people to stay. And it's a slogan: without people, no security, but without security, no people. So it's a role of governments to make sure that we do what we can to live up to what was once a bit of a slogan from the Norwegian side: high north, low tension. It's unfortunately not a precise description of realities, but it remains a policy aim. And that includes, of course, investing a lot more in our defense. For Norway, the high north, the Arctic has always been the number one priority. It's the proximity to Russia that's been the defining factor. And there's a massive amount of opportunities still in the Arctic in terms of green industries, jobs, opportunities for the future, including what is not now, at least in our part of the Arctic, by far the largest growing sector, and that's tourism. People want to come and see as well.
Well, on that, I think, optimistic note of high north, low tension, that is about where we're going to have to leave it, I think. Please stay where you are, because the programme will be continuing straight after we are done here with the next session, looking at a multipolar world as opposed to the merely polar world we have been discussing. But I'd ask you to please thank our panel, Eivind Petersson, State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Norway, Nicole Giles, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister and Deputy Director of Policy and Strategic Partnerships, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and owner, presumably, of one of the world's biggest business cards, and Anna Wieslander, a Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. Thanks all for joining us.